Jake Harris stared out the passenger window of his father's SUV, watching the familiar streets of his childhood neighborhood roll by. At 17, he was caught in that awkward space between boyhood and manhood, a time when everything seemed to be changing faster than he could keep up. But nothing had prepared him for the seismic shift his life was about to take. "You okay, buddy?" Robert Harris glanced at his son, concern etched on his face. "I know this is a big change, but I promise it's going to be great." Jake nodded noncommittally, not trusting himself to speak. How could he tell his dad that he was far from okay? That the thought of moving in with Vanessa, his father's new wife, filled him with a mixture of dread and resentment. It had been just the two of them for so long after Jake's mother passed away when he was 10. They'd formed a tight bond, navigating the choppy waters of grief together. Jake had been there for his dad through the darkest days, and his dad had been his rock. They were a team, a dynamic duo. And now suddenly, there was a third person in the equation. The SUV pulled into the driveway of a house Jake had only visited a handful of times during his father's whirlwind romance with Vanessa. It was bigger than their old place, with a manicured lawn and a 2-car garage. Perfect suburban living. "Home sweet home," Robert announced, his voice tinged with forced cheerfulness. Jake couldn't help but notice the slight tremor in his father's hands as he turned off the ignition. At least he wasn't the only one feeling nervous. As if on cue, the front door opened, and Vanessa stepped out onto the porch. She was objectively beautiful, Jake had to admit, tall and slender, with honey blonde hair and a smile that had charmed his father from their very first meeting. Today, that smile seemed a touch too bright, a little too eager. "Welcome home," Vanessa called out, waving enthusiastically. Jake felt a twinge of guilt for the wave of annoyance that washed over him. She was trying, he knew that. But it all felt so artificial, like they were actors in some cheesy family sitcom. Robert got out of the car first, striding up to Vanessa and giving her a quick kiss. Jake took his time, fiddling with his seatbelt and gathering his backpack, delaying the inevitable. Finally, with a deep breath, he stepped out into the warm summer air. "Jake," Vanessa's voice was warm as she approached him. "I'm so glad you're here. I've got your room all set up. I hope you'll like it." Jake managed a small smile. "Thanks, Vanessa. I'm sure it's great." The words felt hollow in his mouth, but he was determined to at least try to be polite, for his dad's sake, if nothing else. The inside of the house was just as picture-perfect as the outside. Everything seemed new and shiny, a far cry from the lived-in comfort of their old home. Family photos lined the walls, mostly of Robert and Vanessa, with a few older ones of Jake and his dad mixed in. The sight of them made Jake's chest tighten. "So, what do you think?" Robert asked, his eyes hopeful as he watched Jake take in the surroundings. Jake shrugged. "It's nice," he said, aiming for neutrality. "Different." Vanessa jumped in, her enthusiasm seemingly undampened by Jake's lukewarm response. "Wait until you see your room. I've been working on it for weeks. Come on, I'll show you." She led the way upstairs, chattering about color schemes and ergonomic desk chairs. Jake followed more slowly, exchanging a look with his father. Robert gave him an encouraging nod, and Jake felt a fresh wave of guilt. His dad wanted this to work so badly. The least Jake could do was make an effort. The room was not what Jake expected. It was spacious, with a large window overlooking the backyard. But instead of the posters of his favorite bands and the cluttered shelves full of books and video games he was used to, everything was neat and coordinated. The walls were a soft blue, the bedspread a matching shade with white accents. A sleek desk stood in one corner, and a flat-screen TV hung on the wall opposite the bed. Well, Vanessa was practically bouncing with anticipation. "What do you think?" "I tried to make it perfect for you." Jake swallowed hard. He knew he should be grateful. The room was objectively nicer than his old one, but it didn't feel like his. It felt like a room designed for some idealized version of a teenage boy, not the actual Jake Harris. "It's really something," he managed. "Thank you, Vanessa. You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "Oh, it was no trouble at all," Vanessa beamed. "I wanted you to feel at home here. I know it's a big adjustment, but I'm so excited for us all to be a family." There was that word again. Family. Jake felt his chest tighten. He had a family, him and his dad. This was something else entirely. Robert cleared his throat. "Why don't we let Jake get settled in? We can order pizza for dinner, have a little celebration." Jake nodded gratefully, relieved at the chance for some space. "Yeah, that sounds good. I'll just unpack a bit." As soon as the door closed behind them, Jake sank onto the unfamiliar bed, his head in his hands. How had his life changed so drastically in just a matter of months? It seemed like only yesterday that it had been just him and his dad, comfortable in their routine, understanding each other without words. Now he felt like a stranger in his own life. He thought back to the day his father had first told him about Vanessa. It had been a crisp autumn afternoon, and they were at the park where they often played catch. Robert had seemed nervous, fumbling with the baseball as he tried to find the right words. "Jake, you know I'll always love your mom," he had started. "But I've met someone special, and I think she might be the one." Jake had felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. "The one," he had repeated, his voice small. "But what about Mom?" Robert's eyes had filled with tears. "Your mom will always be a part of us, Jake. Always. But she would have wanted us to be happy. To live our lives fully. And Vanessa, she makes me happy in a way I didn't think was possible anymore." Jake had wanted to be happy for his dad. He really had. But all he could feel was a sense of betrayal, as if by loving Vanessa, his father was somehow erasing the memory of his mother. Now, sitting in this too-perfect room, Jake felt those same conflicted emotions bubbling up inside him. He knew, logically, that his father deserved happiness. That Vanessa seemed kind and was clearly trying her best. But knowing something logically and feeling it emotionally were two very different things. A soft knock on the door jolted Jake from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, quickly wiping his eyes. Robert poked his head in. "Hey, champ, you doing okay?" Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. His father came in and sat beside him on the bed, the mattress dipping slightly under his weight. "I know this is tough," Robert said softly, "and I want you to know that it's okay if you're not okay with everything right away. We're all adjusting here." Jake looked up at his father, seeing the mix of hope and worry in his eyes. "I'm trying, Dad. I really am. It's just..." "Just what, buddy? You can tell me anything, you know that." Jake took a deep breath. "It's just, everything's changing so fast. This house, Vanessa, this whole new life. Sometimes I feel like I can't keep up, like I don't fit anymore." Robert put his arm around Jake's shoulders, pulling him close like he used to when Jake was little. "You'll always fit in my life, Jake. Always. You're my son, and nothing and no one will ever change that. Vanessa isn't here to replace anyone or change who we are. She's here to add to our family, not subtract from it." Jake leaned into his father's embrace, feeling some of the tension leave his body. "I know. I miss how things were sometimes." "I do too, buddy. Change isn't easy. But sometimes it can lead us to something even better than we had before. We just have to be brave enough to give it a chance." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Jake straightened up. "I'll try, Dad, I promise." Robert smiled, ruffling Jake's hair. "That's all I ask. Now, how about that pizza? I'm thinking extra cheese, maybe some pepperoni." As they headed downstairs, Jake felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of adjustment. Jake found himself navigating not just a new home, but a whole new family dynamic. Vanessa, ever eager to bond, was constantly suggesting family activities, movie nights, board game tournaments, even a disastrous attempt at a group cooking lesson that ended with the smoke alarm blaring and all three of them laughing hysterically as they fanned the air with dish towels. There were moments of genuine connection, like when Jake discovered that Vanessa shared his love for obscure indie bands, or when she surprised him by remembering his favorite type of muffin from a casual conversation weeks earlier. But there were also moments of tension and awkwardness, silences that stretched too long, and jokes that fell flat. One particular evening stood out in Jake's memory. They were having dinner, a homemade lasagna that Vanessa had spent hours preparing. The conversation had been flowing surprisingly well, with Jake recounting a funny incident from school. And then Mr. Thompson just stood there, chalk dust all over his face, looking like some kind of surprised ghost. Jake finished, grinning at the memory. Robert and Vanessa both laughed, the sound warm and genuine. As the laughter died down, Vanessa reached for her wine glass, a soft smile on her face. "You know, Jake," she said, "you remind me so much of your father when he tells stories. You have the same expressions, the same way of building up to the punchline." It was meant as a compliment, Jake knew that. But something about the casual way she said it, as if she had known his father for years, made his stomach twist. Suddenly, the easy atmosphere of the dinner table felt stifling. I'm actually not that hungry," Jake muttered, pushing his chair back. "May I be excused?" He didn't wait for an answer, fleeing to the safety of his room. Later, he overheard his father and Vanessa talking in low voices downstairs. "I don't understand," Vanessa was saying, her voice tinged with frustration. "I thought we were having a nice time. Did I say something wrong?" "It's not you, honey," Robert replied, his voice weary. Jake's still adjusting. "We all are. We just need to give it time." Time. It seemed to be the answer to everything these days. Time to adjust, time to bond, time to become a real family. But as the days turned into weeks, Jake found himself wondering how much time was enough. And would there ever come a point where this new life felt as natural and comfortable as his old one had? As he lay in bed that night, staring at the unfamiliar shadows on his ceiling, Jake made a silent promise to himself. He would try harder. For his dad's sake, for Vanessa's, and for his own. He would give this new family a real chance. Little did he know, the true test of their fledgling family bond was just around the corner. The tension in the Harris household had been building for weeks, a pressure cooker of emotions just waiting to explode. Jake, now 18 and on the cusp of graduation, found himself increasingly at odds with his new family dynamic. What had started as small irritations, Vanessa's persistent attempts at bonding, his father's constant mediation, had grown into a seething resentment that colored every interaction. It was a crisp Saturday morning in late April when everything finally came to a head. Jake had been out late the night before, celebrating a friend's birthday. He'd texted his dad that he'd be home late, but in the excitement of the party, he'd lost track of time. By the time he'd stumbled through the front door at 3 a.m., the house was dark and silent. Or so he thought. As Jake tried to quietly make his way upstairs, the living room light suddenly flicked on, revealing Vanessa sitting in an armchair, her face a mask of worry and disapproval. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" she hissed, mindful of waking Robert. Jake felt a flash of annoyance. Who was she to wait up for him like this? "I texted Dad," he mumbled, the words slightly slurred, said I'd be late. Vanessa stood up, her arms crossed. "Late is midnight, Jake. Maybe 1 a.m. at a push. It's 3 in the morning. We've been worried sick. Your father finally went to bed an hour ago, but he barely slept. He was about to call the police." The genuine concern in her voice only served to irritate Jake further. He didn't need her worry. He didn't need her acting like she was his mother. "Well, I'm fine," he snapped. "No need for the dramatics." Vanessa's eyes widened at his tone. "Excuse me. I don't think it's dramatic to be concerned when my stepson is out until all hours without so much as a call. I'm not your stepson." The words burst out of Jake before he could stop them, fueled by alcohol and months of pent-up frustration. "You're not my mother, you're not my family, and you don't get to tell me what to do." The silence that followed was deafening. Vanessa took a step back, her face pale with shock. Jake felt a twinge of guilt, but the alcohol in his system and the adrenaline of finally saying what he'd been thinking for months overpowered it. Jake. His father's voice came from the top of the stairs, rough with sleep and confusion. "What's going on down there?" Before anyone could respond, Jake bolted up the stairs, brushing past his bewildered father and slamming his bedroom door shut. He collapsed onto his bed, his head spinning with more than just the effects of alcohol. The next morning dawned bright and unforgiving. Jake woke to a pounding headache and the sickening realization of what had transpired the night before. He could hear muffled voices downstairs, his father and Vanessa, no doubt discussing his outburst. With a groan, Jake dragged himself out of bed and into the shower, letting the hot water wash over him as he tried to piece together a game plan. He knew he'd crossed a line last night, but the thought of apologizing to Vanessa made his stomach churn. How could he explain that it wasn't really about her at all? That it was about missing his mom, about feeling like his old life was slipping away, about the terror of growing up and facing a world that suddenly seemed so much more complicated than he'd ever realized. By the time Jake made his way downstairs, the voices had stopped. He found his father sitting alone at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him. Robert looked up as Jake entered, his expression a mix of disappointment and concern that made Jake's chest tighten with guilt. "Sit down, son," Robert said quietly. "We need to talk." Jake slid into the chair across from his father, bracing himself for the lecture he knew was coming. But Robert just sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Jake, I know these past few months haven't been easy for you, and I understand that you're dealing with a lot of changes. But what happened last night? That's not okay. Vanessa is a part of this family now, whether you like it or not, and she deserves your respect." Jake felt a flare of defensive anger. "Respect? Dad, she was waiting up for me like I'm some little kid. I'm 18. I don't need a babysitter." Robert's eyes hardened. "What you need, apparently, is a reminder of the rules in this house. You live under our roof, you follow our rules. That includes letting us know if you're going to be out past midnight and not coming home drunk." "I told you I'd be late," Jake protested. "Late is not the same as stumbling in at 3 a.m. reeking of beer," Robert countered. "And it certainly doesn't excuse the way you spoke to Vanessa. You hurt her, Jake, deeply." The guilt Jake had been trying to suppress surged to the surface. He knew he'd gone too far, knew that Vanessa didn't deserve the brunt of his frustration, but admitting that felt like surrendering, like accepting this new reality he still wasn't sure he wanted. "I'm sorry," he muttered, not meeting his father's eyes. "I'll apologize to Vanessa." Robert nodded, but his expression remained serious. "I appreciate that, but I think we need to address the bigger issue here. Your behavior lately, the attitude, the staying out late. It's not like you, Jake. What's really going on?" And there it was, the question Jake had been dreading. How could he explain the storm of emotions raging inside him? The grief for his mother that still caught him off guard sometimes, the fear of losing his connection with his dad, the pressure of figuring out his future when he wasn't even sure who he was anymore. "I don't know, Dad," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. I feel like everything's changing so fast, like I'm losing everything that mattered." Robert's expression softened. He reached across the table, placing a hand on Jake's arm. "You're not losing anything, buddy. You're gaining a whole new set of opportunities, a chance at a different kind of happiness. I know it's scary, but change isn't always bad." Jake wanted to believe him. He wanted to embrace this new life, to be the son his father deserved and the Stepson Vanessa was trying so hard to connect with. But there was a part of him that rebelled against it all, that wanted to cling to the past with both hands. "I'm trying, Dad," he said. "I really am. It's just hard." Robert squeezed his arm gently. "I know, son, and we're going to work on this together. But for now, I think you owe Vanessa an apology. And then we're going to discuss your punishment for last night." Jake nodded, resigned. He knew he deserved whatever consequences were coming his way. But as he stood up to go find Vanessa, a new thought struck him. Maybe this was his chance to start fresh, to really try and make this blended family work. He found Vanessa in the backyard, tending to her flower beds with single-minded focus. Jake hesitated at the back door, watching her for a moment. She looked smaller somehow, her shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. The guilt that had been simmering in Jake's gut intensified. "Vanessa," he called out softly, stepping onto the patio. "Can we talk?" She straightened up slowly, turning to face him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and Jake realized with a jolt that she'd been crying. He'd made her cry. The thought made him feel about 2 inches tall. "Of course, Jake," Vanessa said, her voice carefully neutral. "What is it?" Jake took a deep breath, steeling himself. "I wanted to apologize for last night. What I said, it was way out of line. You didn't deserve that." Vanessa's expression softened slightly, but she didn't say anything, waiting for him to continue. "The truth is," Jake went on, the words tumbling out now that he'd started, "I've been struggling with all of this. Not because of you, really, but because I'm scared. Of change, of growing up, of losing the connection I had with my dad. And I guess I've been taking all that out on you, which isn't fair at all." To his surprise, Vanessa set down her gardening tools and crossed the yard to him. "Oh, Jake," she said softly, "I understand. More than you know, actually." She gestured to the patio furniture, and they both sat down. "When I married your father," Vanessa continued, "I was terrified. Not of him, of course. I love him more than I ever thought possible. But I was scared of messing up what you two had, of being the evil stepmother in your story. I still am sometimes." Jake blinked in surprise. He'd been so caught up in his own fears and resentments that he'd never considered Vanessa might be struggling too. "You're not," he said quickly. "The evil stepmother, I mean. You've been really great, actually. Patient, even when I've been a total jerk." A small smile tugged at Vanessa's lips. "Well, I wouldn't say total jerk. Maybe 3/4 at most." The joke, unexpected and gentle, broke the tension. Jake found himself laughing, and after a moment, Vanessa joined in. As their laughter faded, Jake felt something shift between them. Not a magical fix to all their problems, but a crack in the wall he'd built, a glimpse of the possibility of real connection. "I really am sorry," Jake said again, more earnestly this time. "And I want to do better, to try harder to make this work." Vanessa reached out, hesitantly at first, and then with more confidence, placing her hand over Jake's. "That's all I've ever wanted, Jake. For us to be a family. Not to replace what you had with your mom and dad, but to build something new together. Something that can be just as special in its own way." Jake nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I'd like that," he managed to say. They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, the spring sun warm on their faces. Finally, Vanessa spoke again, her tone lighter. "So how bad is your punishment for last night?" Jake groaned dramatically. "I don't know yet, but I'm guessing my social life is about to take a serious hit." Vanessa laughed. "Well, maybe I can put in a good word for you. Stepmom privileges and all that." As they headed back into the house together, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could make this work after all. But life, as Jake was about to learn, is rarely so simple. The fragile peace that had been established that morning was about to be tested in ways none of them could have anticipated. It started small, a missed curfew here, a skipped family dinner there. Jake, emboldened by the reconciliation with Vanessa and his father's apparent relief at the easing of tensions, began to push boundaries. He told himself it was normal teenage behavior, just asserting his independence. But deep down, a part of him was testing the limits of this new family dynamic, seeing how far he could go before someone pushed back. The real trouble began a few weeks later, when Jake's high school announced its prom. It should have been a joyous occasion, a celebration of the end of his high school career. Instead, it became the catalyst for the biggest fight the Harris household had seen yet. Jake had assumed he'd be taking his longtime friend, Mia, to the prom. They'd been dance partners at every school function since middle school, and while they weren't dating, it seemed like the natural choice. But when he casually mentioned his plans over dinner one night, he was met with an unexpected reaction. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful," Vanessa exclaimed. "You know, I still have my old prom dress from high school. I bet we could have it altered to fit Mia perfectly. Wouldn't that be special?" Jake froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Oh, what?" Robert, picking up on Jake's discomfort, tried to intervene. "Sweetheart, I'm not sure Mia would want to wear a dress from our era." But Vanessa was on a roll, her eyes bright with excitement. "Oh, but it's a classic design. And just think how meaningful it would be. It could be like passing down a family heirloom." The word family hit Jake like a punch to the gut. Suddenly, all the progress they'd made over the past few weeks seemed to evaporate. "Mia's not family," he snapped, "and she's definitely not wearing your old dress." The table fell silent. Vanessa's face crumpled, and Robert looked between his wife and son with a mixture of frustration and disappointment. "Jake," he said warningly, "that's enough. Vanessa was just trying to help." But Jake was beyond listening. All the resentment he'd been trying to suppress came bubbling to the surface. "Help? By trying to force her way into every part of my life. This is my prom, not some weird do-over of hers." "Jacob Alexander Harris." Robert's voice thundered through the dining room. "You apologize to Vanessa right now." Jake stood up so abruptly his chair tipped over backwards. "No," he said, his voice shaking with anger and something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to tears. "No, I'm done apologizing. I'm done pretending everything's okay when it's not. I'm done with all of this." Before anyone could stop him, Jake stormed out of the dining room and up the stairs. The sound of his bedroom door slamming echoed through the house like a gunshot. For a long moment, Robert and Vanessa sat in stunned silence. Then, with a quiet sob, Vanessa buried her face in her hands. Robert moved to comfort her, but his eyes were fixed on the stairs, his expression a mix of anger and worry. Upstairs, Jake paced his room like a caged animal. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. He hesitated for just a moment before hitting call. "Hello." A sleepy voice answered on the third ring. "Aunt Sarah," Jake said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "It's Jake. I need your help." Sarah, his mother's sister, had always been Jake's safe haven. She lived a few hours away and had made it clear when Robert remarried that Jake always had a place with her if he needed it. At the time, Jake had brushed off the offer. Now it felt like a lifeline. "Jake, what's wrong? Are you okay?" Sarah's voice sharpened with concern. Jake took a deep breath. "I can't stay here anymore, Aunt Sarah. Can I come stay with you for a while?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a heart-stopping moment, Jake thought she might say no. But then Sarah spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "Of course you can, sweetheart. Always. Do you need me to come get you?" Relief washed over Jake like a wave. "No, I can drive. I'll leave tonight, once they're asleep. I need to get out of here." As he hung up the phone, Jake could hear raised voices from downstairs, his father and Vanessa, no doubt arguing about what to do with him. The sound steeled his resolve. He couldn't stay here, couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it felt like he was drowning. With shaking hands, Jake began to pack a bag. Clothes, his laptop, a few cherished photos. As he worked, he tried not to think about what he was leaving behind, his childhood home, his friends, the life he'd known. But most of all, he tried not to think about his father's face when he realized Jake was gone. It was well past midnight when Jake finally crept downstairs, his backpack slung over one shoulder and his car keys clutched tightly in his hand. The house was dark and quiet, his father and Vanessa having retreated to their room hours ago. As he reached for the front door, Jake's eyes fell on a framed photo on the entryway table. It was from his father and Vanessa's wedding day, the three of them smiling at the camera, looking for all the world like a happy family. The harsh glare of early morning sunlight filtered through the windshield, causing Jake to squint as he pulled into the parking lot of a nondescript roadside diner. He'd been driving for hours, the monotony of the highway broken only by the occasional burst of panic or guilt that threatened to overwhelm him. Now, as he cut the engine and leaned back in his seat, the full weight of what he'd done began to settle on his shoulders. He'd actually left. The thought seemed surreal, like something out of a movie rather than his real life. Jake closed his eyes, trying to shut out the memory of sneaking out of the house in the dead of night, of the way his hands had shaken as he'd started the car, of the lump in his throat as he'd watched his childhood home disappear in the rearview mirror. His phone, silent for the first few hours of his journey, had erupted into a cacophony of notifications around dawn. Missed calls from his dad, frantic text messages from Vanessa, even a few worried queries from friends who'd somehow already heard the news. Jake had shut it off, unable to bear the thought of facing their reactions. Now, as he finally powered the device back on, he was met with a barrage of new messages. His finger hovered over his dad's name for a long moment before he shook his head, shoving the phone back into his pocket. He wasn't ready, not yet. Inside the diner, the smell of coffee and greasy breakfast foods assaulted Jake's senses. He slid into a booth near the back, ordering a coffee and toast he wasn't sure he'd be able to stomach. As he waited, he found himself people-watching, wondering about the lives and stories of the other patrons. Did any of them feel as lost and conflicted as he did? A middle-aged woman caught his eye, offering a small smile as she caroled two young children into a nearby booth. Jake felt a pang in his chest, memories of family breakfasts with his mom and dad flooding his mind. For a moment, he was tempted to call his father, to apologize and beg to come home. But the thought of facing Vanessa, of trying to fit back into a life that no longer felt like his own, stopped him cold. Miles away in the Harris household, the atmosphere was thick with tension and fear. Robert paced the living room, his cell phone clutched tightly in his hand as he listened to Jake's voicemail for what felt like the 100th time. "Anything?" Vanessa asked from the doorway, her voice hoarse from a sleepless night of tears and worry. Robert shook his head, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Nothing. It's like he's just vanished." Vanessa moved to sit on the couch, her normally put-together appearance in disarray. "I called the school," she said quietly. "And all of his friends that I have numbers for. No one's heard from him." The unspoken fear hung heavy in the air between them. What if something had happened to Jake? What if he was hurt, or worse? The possibilities were too terrible to contemplate. "I should call the police," Robert said, his voice rough with emotion. "File a missing persons report." Vanessa hesitated. Do you think he might have gone to Sarah's?" Robert froze. The thought hadn't occurred to him, but now that Vanessa mentioned it, it seemed glaringly obvious. Of course, Jake would go to his aunt, to the last remaining link to his mother. With shaking hands, Robert dialed Sarah's number. The wait as the phone rang seemed interminable. Finally, a click, and then Sarah's voice, cautious and a little cold. "Hello, Robert." "Sarah," Robert breathed, relief and anger warring in his tone. "Is he there? Is Jake with you?" A pause, heavy with unspoken words. Then, "Yes, Robert. Jake's here. He's safe." Robert sagged against the wall, a sob of relief escaping him. Vanessa was at his side in an instant, her hand on his arm as she listened intently. "Put him on the phone," Robert demanded. "I need to talk to him." "I don't think that's a good idea right now," Sarah replied, her voice maddeningly calm. "Jake needs some time, Robert. Some space to sort things out." "Space." Robert's voice rose, anger overtaking relief. "He's my son, Sarah. You can't just harbor him like this." "I'm not harboring anyone," Sarah shot back. "I'm providing a safe place for my nephew, who clearly felt he had nowhere else to turn. Maybe instead of yelling at me, You should be asking yourself why Jake felt he needed to run away in the first place." The words hit Robert like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to argue, but found he had no words. Sarah's voice softened slightly. "Look, Robert, I know you're worried, but Jake is 18. He's legally an adult, and he made the choice to come here. Give him some time to process everything. When he's ready, I promise I'll encourage him to call you." The call ended, leaving Robert staring blankly at the phone in his hand. Vanessa guided him to the couch, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "He's okay," she said softly. "He's safe. That's what matters right now." Robert nodded numbly, the relief of knowing Jake was safe warring with the pain of his son's rejection. "What did I do wrong?" he whispered. "How did I not see this coming?" Vanessa wrapped her arms around him, her voice thick with emotion. "We'll figure this out, Robert. Together. We'll find a way to make this right." As the days turned into weeks, life settled into a new, uncomfortable rhythm for all involved. Jake, ensconced in the guest room of his Aunt Sarah's cozy apartment, found himself adrift in a sea of conflicting emotions. The initial rush of freedom and relief at escaping the tensions of home had faded, replaced by a gnawing sense of guilt and uncertainty. Sarah, true to her word, didn't push Jake to return home or even to call his father. Instead, she provided a listening ear and a shoulder to cry on when the weight of his decisions became too much to bear. She shared stories of Jake's mother, filling in gaps in his memories and helping him feel connected to a part of himself he'd been missing. But she also gently encouraged Jake to think about his future. "You can't hide here forever, sweetie," she'd say, her voice kind but firm. "At some point, you're going to have to face the music and figure out what you want your life to look like." Jake knew she was right, but the thought of confronting the mess he'd left behind was overwhelming. Instead, he threw himself into helping Sarah at the small bookstore she owned, losing himself in the world of literature and the quiet routine of organizing shelves and assisting customers. It was during one of these quiet afternoons at the bookstore that Jake had an unexpected encounter that would shift his perspective. He was restocking the poetry section when a voice behind him made him start. "Excuse me, do you have any collections by Mary Oliver?" Jake turned to find himself face to face with a girl about his age, her dark curls framing a face that was both striking and somehow familiar. Yeah, I think we do," he stammered, caught off guard. "Let me check." As he scanned the shelves, the girl tilted her head, studying him. "You're new here, aren't you? I don't remember seeing you before." Jake nodded, finally locating a volume of Oliver's poems. "Yeah, I'm just visiting my aunt for a while, helping out in the store." The girl smiled, accepting the book. I'm kind of a regular here. Your aunt's store is my favorite place in town." "Jake," he replied, finding himself smiling back despite his usual reticence with strangers. There was something about Zoe that put him at ease, a warmth in her eyes that invited confidence. Over the next few weeks, Zoe became a frequent visitor to the bookstore, always with a recommendation or a question that would lead to long discussions about literature, life, and everything in between. Jake found himself looking forward to her visits, the heaviness in his chest lifting a little each time she walked through the door. It was Zoe who finally got Jake to open up about why he was really in town. Sitting in a quiet corner of the store one afternoon, surrounded by stacks of books, Jake found himself pouring out the whole story: his mother's death, his father's remarriage, the tension with Vanessa, and his dramatic departure. Zoe listened without judgment, her dark eyes sympathetic. When Jake finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "You know," she said softly, "I lost my dad when I was 12. Cancer. It changes you, losing a parent like that." Jake nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Yeah, it really does." "But," Zoe continued, "I think sometimes we get so caught up in holding on to the past, onto our grief, that we forget to let ourselves heal, to let new love in." The words hit Jake like a thunderbolt. Had that been what he was doing? Holding so tightly to the memory of his mother, to the life he had before, that he refused to give Vanessa a real chance. I'm not saying what you did was wrong, Zoe added quickly, seeing the conflict on Jake's face. Sometimes we need to step away to get perspective, but maybe it's time to start thinking about stepping back. The suggestion hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and fear. Jake didn't respond, but the seed had been planted. For the first time since he'd left home, he found himself truly considering what it might mean to go back. Meanwhile, back at the Harris household, Robert and Vanessa were grappling with their own challenges. The initial shock and anger at Jake's departure had given way to a deep, pervasive sadness. The house felt emptier, the silence in Jake's room a constant reminder of their fractured family. Robert threw himself into his work, staying late at the office and bringing files home on weekends. Vanessa, determined to keep their home life as normal as possible, redoubled her efforts at creating a warm, welcoming environment, but the strain was beginning to show in both of them. It was Vanessa who finally broke the stalemate. One evening, as they sat picking at a dinner neither of them had much appetite for, she set down her fork with a decisive clank. "This can't go on, Robert," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We can't keep living like this, pretending everything's fine when we're both falling apart." Robert looked up, startled by the break in their usual stilted dinner conversation. "What are you suggesting?" Vanessa took a deep breath. I think we need to see someone, a family therapist, to help us work through all of this and figure out how to move forward." Robert's first instinct was to argue, to insist they could handle things on their own. But as he looked at Vanessa, at the mix of determination and vulnerability in her eyes, he felt something inside him soften. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, let's do it." The decision to seek help marked a turning point for Robert and Vanessa. In the therapist's office, they began to unpack the complex tangle of emotions surrounding Jake's departure and their blended family dynamics. It wasn't easy. There were tears, arguments, and moments of painful honesty. But slowly, they began to see each other and their situation with new eyes. For Robert, it meant confronting the fact that in his eagerness to move forward with his new life with Vanessa, he'd inadvertently left Jake behind. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he admitted in one particularly emotional session. "I thought I was showing Jake that it was okay to be happy again, to love again. But maybe I was just running from my own grief." Vanessa, in turn, had to face her own insecurities and the ways in which she'd tried too hard to fit into a pre-existing family dynamic. "I wanted so badly to be a mother to Jake," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I think I forgot that he already had a mother, even as she wasn't here anymore. I was trying to fill a role that wasn't mine to fill." As they worked through their issues, Robert and Vanessa began to rebuild their relationship on a stronger, more honest foundation. They talked about Jake often, sharing memories and hopes for reconciliation. But they also began to rediscover each other, to remember why they'd fallen in love in the first place. It was during this time that Robert finally worked up the courage to call Sarah again. The conversation was awkward at first, both of them dancing around the elephant in the room. But as they talked, Robert found himself opening up about the therapy, about the realizations he had. "I messed up, Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know that now. I want a chance to make it right." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then softly, "I think Jake might be ready to hear that, Robert. He's been doing a lot of thinking too." The spark of hope that ignited in Robert's chest was almost painful in its intensity. Can I talk to him?" Another pause, and then the sound of the phone being passed. Jake's voice, hesitant and a little shaky, came through the line. "Dad." Robert closed his eyes, tears spilling down his cheeks. "Jake. Oh, Jake. I'm so sorry, son, for everything." As father and son began the tentative process of reconnecting, miles apart, but bridging the gap with words and shared tears, the future began to look a little brighter. The path forward was still uncertain, fraught with potential pitfalls and unresolved issues. But for the first time in months, there was hope for healing, for understanding, and for a new kind of family that could encompass all the complicated, messy love they shared. The separate paths they had been walking began to curve, slowly but surely, back towards each other. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But with open hearts and minds, they were all ready to take the next step together. The old Chevy pickup truck rumbled down the highway, its aged engine protesting as Robert pushed it to maintain a steady 65 miles per hour. He bought this truck years ago, intending to restore it with Jake as a father-son project. Like so many of their plans, it had fallen by the wayside, gathering dust in the garage as life and circumstances pulled them in different directions. Now, as Robert made the long drive to Sarah's town, the truck seemed a fitting metaphor for his relationship with Jake, a little battered, in need of serious work, but still fundamentally sound. At least he hoped it was. The conversation with Jake a week ago had been brief, tentative, filled with awkward pauses and things left unsaid, but it had ended with an invitation, or perhaps more accurately, a challenge. "If you really want to talk, Dad," Jake had said, his voice a mixture of hope and wariness, "then come here. Show me you're serious." So here Robert was, embarking on a journey that felt infinitely longer than the actual miles on the odometer. He'd left a note for Vanessa, not wanting to wake her for what would inevitably be a tearful goodbye. Her support had been unwavering, even as he'd struggled to articulate why he felt he needed to make this trip alone. "This is something you and Jake need to do together," she'd said, her eyes shining with a mixture of love and sadness. "I'll be here when you get back. Both of you, I hope." As the miles rolled by, Robert found himself lost in memories. Jake as a toddler, taking his first wobbling steps across the living room. Jake at 10, brave face crumpling as they lowered his mother's casket into the ground. Jake at 16, rolling his eyes good-naturedly at Robert's attempt to give him driving lessons. What had it all gone wrong? The question had haunted Robert for months, but now, with the perspective gained from therapy and long nights of soul-searching, he was beginning to see the cracks that had formed long before Jake's dramatic departure. It wasn't just the remarriage, though that had certainly been a catalyst. It was the years of unprocessed grief, of trying to be both mother and father to a boy who was hurting just as much as he was. It was the subtle shift in their dynamic as Jake grew older, Robert's attempts to maintain authority clashing with Jake's need for independence. And yes, it was Vanessa, not through any fault of her own, but in what she represented. A new beginning, a chance at happiness that, in Jake's eyes, might have seemed like a betrayal of the past they shared. Lost in thought, Robert almost missed his exit. He swerved at the last moment, earning an angry honk from a passing car. His heart raced, and not just from the near miss. He was close now. In less than an hour, he'd be face to face with his son for the first time in months. What would he say? The speeches he'd rehearsed on the long drive suddenly seemed inadequate, trite in the face of the real, complicated emotions roiling inside him. As he navigated the streets of the unfamiliar town, Robert's eye was caught by a small flower shop. On impulse, he pulled over. The bell above the door tinkled as he entered, and a kind-faced older woman looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you?" she asked, taking in Robert's travel-worn appearance with a sympathetic smile. I'm trying to apologize to someone," Robert said, his voice rough with emotion. "My son. I've made a lot of mistakes, and I'm not sure flowers are enough, but..." The woman's eyes softened. "Oh, honey, flowers might not fix everything, but they're a start. How about we put together something that says I'm sorry and I love you all at once?" 20 minutes later, Robert was back on the road, a carefully crafted bouquet on the passenger seat beside him. Roses for love, daisies for new beginnings, and forget-me-nots, a poignant reminder of the memories they shared. Sarah's apartment building loomed before him all too soon. Robert sat in the truck for a long moment, gathering his courage. Finally, with a deep breath, he grabbed the flowers and made his way to the front door. Jake had been pacing the small guest room for what felt like hours, alternating between staring out the window and checking his phone. When Sarah had told him his father was coming, Jake had felt a dizzying mix of emotions: hope, fear, anger, longing. Now, as the moment of truth approached, he felt almost sick with anticipation. A knock at the bedroom door startled him. "Jake." Sarah's voice was gentle. "He's here." Jake's throat went dry. "Oh, okay," he managed. I'll be right out." He took a moment to study his reflection in the mirror, running a hand through his hair in a futile attempt to tame it. The face that looked back at him seemed older somehow, the past few months having left their mark in subtle ways. With a final deep breath, Jake stepped out of the room. He could hear murmured voices from the living room, his father and Sarah, their tones careful and measured. Rounding the corner, he saw them first. Sarah, her posture protective, even as she smiled encouragingly, and his father. Robert turned at the sound of Jake's footsteps, and for a moment, father and son simply stared at each other. The bouquet trembled slightly in Robert's hands. "Jake," Robert breathed, his eyes drinking in the sight of his son. These are for you." He held out the flowers, a peace offering laden with meaning. Jake stepped forward slowly, accepting the bouquet. The familiar scent of the flowers, so like the ones his mother used to grow in their backyard, brought a lump to his throat. "Thanks, Dad," he said softly. An awkward silence fell, both of them unsure how to bridge the chasm that had grown between them. It was Sarah who finally broke the tension. "Why don't you two take a walk?" she suggested. "There's a nice park just down the street. Might be good to get some fresh air." The idea of being alone with his father sent a spike of anxiety through Jake, but he nodded. "Yeah, okay. Let me just put these in water first." As Jake busied himself with the flowers, Robert and Sarah exchanged a look. "Remember what we talked about?" Sarah said quietly. "Listen to him, Robert. Really listen." Robert nodded, his expression solemn. "I will, I promise." The walk to the park was silent, both Robert and Jake lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't until they reached a secluded bench overlooking a small pond that Robert finally spoke. "Jake, hi. I don't even know where to begin. I'm so sorry for everything." Jake sat down heavily, his eyes fixed on the water. "You said that on the phone," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "What does that mean exactly? Sorry for what?" Robert joined him on the bench, leaving a careful distance between them. "For not seeing how much you were hurting. For pushing forward with my life with Vanessa without making sure you were really okay with it. For not being the father you needed me to be." Jake was quiet for a long moment, absently tearing a leaf into tiny pieces. "I wanted to be okay with it," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to be, but it felt like you were trying to replace Mom. Replace our old life, and I wasn't ready for that." "Oh, Jake." Robert's voice cracked. "That was never my intention. Your mother, she'll always be a part of us. Always. I thought by moving forward, I was showing you that it was okay to be happy again. But I realize now that I was running from my own grief, and I dragged you along before you were ready." Jake looked up, surprised by his father's candor. "You were grieving too," he said slowly, as if just realizing it. "I guess I didn't really think about that. I was so caught up in my own pain." Robert nodded, blinking back tears. "We both were, and instead of facing it together, we let it drive us apart. I'm so sorry for that, son. So incredibly sorry." The sincerity in his father's voice broke something open in Jake. Before he knew it, he was crying, deep, racking sobs that shook his entire body. Robert hesitated for just a moment before pulling Jake into his arms, holding him close like he used to when Jake was small. "I missed you," Jake choked out between sobs. "I was so angry, but I miss you so much." "I missed you too," Robert murmured, his own tears falling into Jake's hair. "Every single day. Our home. It's not home without you, Jake." They sat like that for a long time, years of unspoken emotions pouring out in a cathartic release. As Jake's sobs gradually subsided, he pulled back, wiping his eyes with the heel of his hand. "So, what happens now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Robert took a deep breath. "That's up to you, Jake. I'd love for you to come home. Vanessa and we've been in therapy, working through our issues. We want to make things right, but I understand if you're not ready for that." Jake was quiet, considering. The thought of going back, of facing Vanessa and trying to rebuild their fractured family was daunting. But staying away, continuing to hide from his problems, that wasn't the answer either. I think I'd like to come home," he said slowly, "but I can't promise it'll be easy. There's a lot we still need to work through." Robert nodded, hope looming in his chest. "I know, and we will together. No more sweeping things under the rug. No more pretending everything's fine when it's not. We'll face it all as a family." As they made their way back to Sarah's apartment, the air between them felt lighter, the first tendrils of that old easy rapport beginning to resurface. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in months, both father and son felt a glimmer of real hope. Sarah was waiting for them, her expression anxious. When she saw their red-rimmed eyes but tentative smiles, she let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Everything okay?" she asked cautiously. Jake nodded, glancing at his father. "Yeah, I think it will be. I'm going to go home, Aunt Sarah." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled bravely. "I'm so glad, sweetheart. But remember, you always have a place here if you need it." As Jake went to pack his things, Robert turned to Sarah. "Thank you," he said softly, "for taking care of him, for everything." Sarah nodded, her expression softening. "He's family, Robert. Just don't make me regret sending him back with you, okay?" "I won't," Robert promised. "Things are going to be different this time. Better." The drive back home was filled with tentative conversation, Jake and Robert carefully navigating the new landscape of their relationship. They talked about Jake's time at the bookstore, about the friend he'd made in Zoe. Robert filled Jake in on some of the insights he and Vanessa had gained in therapy. As they neared their hometown, Jake's anxiety began to rise. Do you think Vanessa will be mad at me?" he asked, his voice small. Robert shook his head. "No, Jake, she's been worried sick about you. All she wants is for you to be happy and for us to be a family. But I want you to know, there's no pressure. We'll take this at whatever pace you're comfortable with." When they finally pulled into the driveway of their home, Vanessa was waiting on the porch. Her eyes were red from crying, but her smile was radiant as she saw Jake step out of the truck. For a moment, everyone stood frozen, unsure of how to proceed. Then, with a choked sob, Vanessa rushed forward, enveloping Jake in a tight hug. After a second's hesitation, Jake hugged her back. "Welcome home," Vanessa whispered, her voice thick with emotion. As Robert joined them, wrapping his arms around both his wife and his son, Jake felt something settle in his chest. It wasn't perfect. There were still hurt feelings to address, trust to rebuild, and a lot of work ahead. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like home. The olive branch had been extended and accepted. Now, the real work of healing could begin. The soft glow of the therapist's lamp cast long shadows across the room as Jake, Robert, and Vanessa sat in a semicircle, the tension palpable in the air between them. It had been 3 weeks since Jake's return home, and while the initial joy of reunion had buoyed them for a time, the underlying issues that had driven them apart were beginning to resurface. Dr. Elena Ramirez, a family therapist with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, looked at each of them in turn. "I'm glad you've all agreed to come today," she said, her voice warm but professional. "Blending families is never easy, and you've all been through a lot. But the fact that you're here, willing to do this work together, is a huge step in the right direction." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding eye contact with Vanessa. The past few weeks had been a roller coaster of emotions. Moments of genuine connection interspersed with awkward silences and flare-ups of old resentments. He'd agreed to family therapy more for his dad's sake than anything else, but now, Faced with the reality of it, he was having second thoughts. Why don't we start by having each of you share what you hope to gain from these sessions? Dr. Ramirez suggested. Robert cleared his throat. I want us to be a real family, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I want to understand where we went wrong before and learn how to do better. I can't lose my son again. He glanced at Jake, his eyes pleading. Vanessa nodded, wringing her hands in her lap. I want that too, she said softly. I want Jake to feel like this is his home, that he belongs here. And I want to find my place in this family without stepping on toes or trying to replace anyone. All eyes turned to Jake, who felt the weight of their expectations like a physical pressure. I guess I want, he started, then paused, searching for the right words. I want to stop feeling angry all the time. I want to understand why I felt like I had to run away and make sure I never feel that way again. Dr. Ramirez nodded approvingly. Those are all excellent goals. Now, achieving them won't be easy. It's going to require honesty, vulnerability, and a willingness to confront some uncomfortable truths. Are you all prepared for that? The trio exchanged glances, a mix of determination and apprehension on their faces. Slowly, they each nodded. Good, Dr. Ramirez said. Then let's begin by exploring the events that led to Jake's departure. Jake, can you walk us through what was going through your mind in the days leading up to that night? Jake took a deep breath, his hands clenching into fists as he remembered the turmoil of those days. I felt trapped, he said finally. Like I was suffocating in my own home. Everything was changing so fast, and I felt like I was the only one who wasn't okay with it. Can you elaborate on that? Dr. Ramirez prompted gently. Jake nodded, the words starting to flow more freely now. It was like, suddenly, there was this whole new life happening around me, and I was just supposed to slot into it like nothing had changed. Dad was so happy with Vanessa, and I felt guilty for not being happy too. But every time I saw them together, all I could think about was Mom, and how it felt like we were leaving her behind. Robert made a pained sound, but Dr. Ramirez held up a hand, silently asking him to let Jake finish. And Vanessa, Jake continued, glancing apologetically at his stepmother, I know you were trying, but it felt like you were trying to erase our old life. Redecorating the house, changing our routines. I know now that wasn't your intention, but at the time, it felt like you were trying to replace my mom. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, encouraging Jake to continue. The night I left, it wasn't really about the prom dress, Jake admitted. That was just the final straw. I felt like I was disappearing, like there wasn't room for me in this new family. So I ran. A heavy silence fell over the room as Jake's words sank in. Dr. Ramirez let it linger for a moment before turning to Robert and Vanessa. How does hearing this make you feel? She asked. Robert spoke first, his voice choked with emotion. I had no idea you were feeling that way, Jake. I thought by moving forward, by showing that it was okay to be happy again, I was helping you. I never meant to make you feel like we were leaving your mother behind. Vanessa wiped at her eyes. Oh, Jake, she said softly. I'm so sorry. I was so focused on trying to make everything perfect, on trying to be a good stepmother, that I didn't see how much I was overwhelming you. I never wanted to replace your mom. I wanted us to be a family. Dr. Ramirez nodded encouragingly. These are all very common feelings in blended families. Robert, Vanessa, can you share a bit about what you were experiencing during this time? Robert ran a hand through his hair, his expression pained. I was terrified, he admitted. Terrified of messing up, of failing Jake, of not honoring Catherine's memory. I threw myself into my relationship with Vanessa because it felt safe, because it was easier than facing my grief and guilt. I told myself that if I could just make this new family work, everything would be okay. Vanessa reached out, taking Robert's hand. I was scared too, she said. I loved Robert so much, and I wanted to love Jake just as much. But I didn't know how. I'd never been a mother before, and suddenly I had this teenage stepson who I desperately wanted to connect with. I think I tried too hard, pushed too fast. I was so afraid of being the wicked stepmother that I overcompensated. As the session continued, layers of misunderstanding and miscommunication were slowly peeled away. There were tears, moments of frustration, and painful revelations. But there were also breakthrough moments of understanding, tentative olive branches extended across the divide that had grown between them. Dr. Ramirez guided them through exercises designed to improve communication and foster empathy. She helped them establish new family routines that respected both the past and the present, finding ways to honor Catherine's memory while also embracing their new family dynamic. One particularly powerful moment came during a session focused on grief. Dr. Ramirez had asked them to bring in objects that reminded them of Catherine. Jake brought a worn paperback, his mother's favorite novel, which she used to read to him when he was little. Robert chose a small, framed photo of Catherine that had sat on his bedside table for years after her death. To everyone's surprise, Vanessa also had something, a pressed flower from Catherine's memorial service, which she kept as a reminder of the woman who had been so important to the family she was joining. "I want you to share why you chose these objects," Dr. Ramirez instructed, "and then I want you to talk about how Catherine's memory fits into your life now." As they shared their stories and memories, a new understanding began to form. Jake realized that his father and Vanessa weren't trying to erase his mother's memory, but were struggling to find a way to honor it while also moving forward. Robert and Vanessa gained a deeper appreciation for the depth of Jake's loss and the importance of keeping Catherine's memory alive in their new family. The healing process wasn't linear. There were setbacks, arguments that escalated too quickly, old hurts that resurfaced unexpectedly. But slowly, surely, they began to forge a new path together. One breakthrough came about 2 months into their therapy sessions. Jake had been struggling with whether to attend his senior prom, the event that had sparked the argument leading to his departure. The thought of going brought up a mix of emotions, excitement, anxiety, and a lingering sense of guilt. It was Vanessa who finally broached the subject one evening as they were cleaning up after dinner. "Jake," she said hesitantly, "I know prom is coming up. I was wondering, would you like to go shopping for a suit this weekend? Only if you want to, of course." Jake tensed, memories of their previous prom-related argument flashing through his mind. But as he looked at Vanessa, he saw only genuine care and a touch of nervous hope in her eyes. He thought about the progress they'd made, the understanding they'd begun to build. "Actually," he said slowly, "that would be great. Maybe Dad could come too. Make it a family thing." The smile that lit up Vanessa's face was radiant, and Robert, overhearing from the living room, felt a warmth spreading in his chest. It was a small step, but a significant one. The shopping trip turned out to be a surprisingly enjoyable experience. As Jake tried on suits, Robert and Vanessa offered opinions and encouragement. There were moments of laughter, like when Jake emerged from the dressing room in a garishly patterned tuxedo jacket that had them all in stitches. But there were also quieter, more poignant moments. As Jake stood before a mirror, adjusting the tie of the suit they'd finally chosen, Robert felt a lump form in his throat. "You look so grown up," he said softly. "Your mom would be so proud of you." Jake met his father's eyes in the mirror, his own gaze misty. "You think so?" "I know so," Robert affirmed. "She'd be proud of all of us, I think. For working through this, for becoming a family." Vanessa, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, quietly excused herself to give father and son some privacy. As she browsed a nearby rack of dresses, she felt a tap on her shoulder. "Vanessa," Jake's voice was hesitant, "I was thinking, would you maybe want to help me choose a corsage for my date? I remember you mentioned once that you used to work in a flower shop." The request, so simple yet so meaningful, brought tears to Vanessa's eyes. "I'd love to, Jake," she managed, her heart swelling with a love she almost given up hope of feeling reciprocated. As they left the store, purchases in hand, there was a newfound ease in their interactions. The future still held challenges, but for perhaps the first time, they truly felt like a family facing them together. The night of the prom arrived, bringing with it a flurry of activity. As Jake prepared upstairs, Robert and Vanessa waited nervously in the living room. When Jake finally descended the stairs, looking handsome and somehow older in his new suit, both Robert and Vanessa felt a surge of pride and love. "You look amazing, honey," Vanessa said warmly, stepping forward to straighten his tie. Jake smiled, the expression more relaxed and genuine than it had been in months. "Thanks, Vanessa, for everything." As Robert snapped photos and Vanessa fussed over Jake's boutonniere, there was a sense of rightness, of pieces finally falling into place. They weren't a perfect family, such a thing didn't exist. But they were their own kind of family, one forged through pain and healing, misunderstandings, and newfound empathy. Later that night, as Jake danced with his date beneath twinkling lights, he found his thoughts drifting to his unusual family. His dad and Vanessa, probably waiting up for him at home. His mom, a bittersweet but cherished memory. And somewhere in between, the new understanding they'd all fought so hard to achieve. It wasn't the family he'd imagined having at 18. It was messy and complicated, and sometimes still fragile. But as Jake looked around at his classmates, many from their own diverse family situations, he realized something profound. Every family had its struggles, its unique challenges to overcome. What mattered was the love that held them together, the willingness to fight for each other even when it seemed impossible. As the last dance came to an end, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. He was ready to go home, not to the idealized version of home he'd clung to for so long, but to the real, imperfect, beautiful home they were building together. A home where the past was honored but not enshrined, where the present was embraced with all its complications, and where the future held the promise of continued growth and understanding. The healing wasn't complete. It might never be, not fully. But understanding had bloomed where once there was only hurt and anger. And with that understanding came hope, resilience, and the unshakable knowledge that they were stronger together than they ever could be apart. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and new beginnings as Jake Harris stood in the driveway, staring at the car packed to the brim with boxes and bags. It was move-in day at State University, and the moment he'd been both anticipating and dreading had finally arrived. "I think that's the last of it," Robert said, closing the trunk with a satisfying thunk. He turned to Jake, his eyes misty but his smile proud. "You ready for this, kiddo?" Jake nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "As ready as I'll ever be, I guess." Vanessa emerged from a house, carrying a basket filled with homemade cookies and other snacks for the road. "I made your favorites," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "Just in case the dining hall food isn't up to par." As Jake accepted the basket, his hand brushed Vanessa's, and he felt a surge of affection for his stepmother. It had been a year since his return home, a year of ups and downs, of therapy sessions and late-night conversations, of slowly rebuilding trust and forging a new kind of family bond. The journey hadn't been easy, but standing here now, Jake knew it had been worth every difficult moment. "Thanks, Vanessa," he said softly, "for everything." Vanessa's eyes welled up, and before Jake knew it, he was enveloped in a tight hug. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, "we're going to miss you so much." As Robert joined the embrace, Jake felt a complex swirl of emotions, excitement for the future, nostalgia for the past, and a deep, abiding love for these two people who had fought so hard to understand him, to make their unusual family work. The drive to the university was filled with a mixture of nervous chatter and comfortable silences. Jake found himself reminiscing about the past year, marveling at how far they'd come. There had been milestone moments, like the day Jake had finally felt comfortable calling Vanessa Mom for the first time. It had happened organically, during a particularly competitive family game night. Jake had won a crucial round and, caught up in the excitement, had exclaimed, "Ha! Take that, Mom." The room had gone silent for a moment, all of them processing the significance of the word. Then Vanessa had burst into tears of joy, and they'd ended up in a group hug, the game forgotten. But it was the smaller moments that really stood out in Jake's memory. The quiet Sunday mornings when he'd come downstairs to find Robert and Vanessa slow dancing in the kitchen to his mother's favorite songs. The evenings spent helping Vanessa in her newly planted garden, talking about everything and nothing as they tended to the growing plants. The weekends spent working on that old Chevy truck with his dad, finally finishing the restoration project they'd started years ago. There had been challenges too, of course. The first time Jake had brought Zoe home to meet the family had been a tense affair, with everyone on their best behavior, but acutely aware of the complex dynamics at play. But Zoe, with her easy smile and genuine warmth, had somehow managed to charm them all. She'd even bonded with Vanessa over a shared love of obscure poetry, much to Jake's amused disbelief. As they neared the university campus, Jake felt a familiar pang of anxiety. "Dad," he said, his voice small, What if I can't do this?" Robert glanced at his son, his expression softening. "You can, Jake. You're stronger than you know. And remember, home is always just a phone call away." Vanessa turned in her seat to face Jake. "And don't forget, you have a standing invitation for Sunday dinners. Every week if you want." Jake smiled, grateful for their support. "Thanks. I think I'll take you up on that. Maybe not every week, but often." The campus was a whirlwind of activity, with families helping new students move into dorms and tearful goodbyes happening all around them. As they unloaded Jake's belongings and helped him set up his half of the small dorm room, there was a sense of déjà vu. It wasn't so long ago that they'd been in a similar situation, helping Jake move into Aunt Sarah's guest room. But this time, the mood was entirely different, excitement tinged with sadness, rather than anger and hurt. As the last poster was hung and the final drawer organized, the moment they'd all been dreading arrived. It was time for Robert and Vanessa to leave. "So," Robert said, his voice gruff with emotion, "I guess this is it, huh?" Jake nodded, suddenly feeling very young and very old all at once. "Yeah, I guess so." There was a moment of awkward silence, and then they were all hugging, a tangle of arms and tears, and whispered "I love yous." As Robert and Vanessa finally pulled away, Vanessa reached into her purse. "We have something for you," she said, pulling out a small, wrapped package. Jake opened it carefully, revealing a framed photo. But it wasn't just any photo, it was a carefully crafted collage. In the center was a picture of Jake with Robert and Vanessa, taken at his high school graduation. Surrounding it was smaller photos, Jake as a baby with his mom and dad, a recent picture of him and Zoe, a shot of all of them working on the Chevy together. And there, given a place of honor, was a beautiful photo of Catherine, Jake's mother, her smile radiant and loving. "We wanted you to have a piece of all of us with you," Robert explained, his voice thick with emotion. "Your past, your present, and the promise of your future." Jake stared at the photo, tears blurring his vision. It was everything they'd worked towards over the past year, honoring the past while embracing the present, acknowledging the complex tapestry of love and loss that had brought them to this point. "It's perfect," he managed, clutching the frame to his chest. "Thank you, both of you." As Robert and Vanessa finally drove away, Jake watched from his dorm room window, a mixture of emotions swirling in his chest. There was sadness at the separation, anxiety about the unknown challenges ahead. But overriding it all was a sense of security, of knowing that no matter what happened, he had a family to fall back on, a family that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger for it. The first few weeks of college life were a whirlwind of new experiences. Jake threw himself into his classes, joined a few clubs, and slowly began to form new friendships. But every Sunday evening, without fail, he'd call home. Those calls became a lifeline, a touchstone to the life he'd left behind. He'd tell Robert and Vanessa about his classes, about the new friends he was making, about the challenges he was facing. They, in turn, would fill him in on life at home, Vanessa's latest gardening triumphs, Robert's adventures in learning to cook, with mixed results, the latest antics of the stray cat they'd recently adopted. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of homesickness so intense Jake thought his heart might break. There were times when the stress of exams and papers and new social dynamics felt overwhelming. But in those moments, Jake would look at the framed photo collage on his desk, and he'd remember the strength they'd found together. As the semester progressed, Jake found himself growing in ways he hadn't anticipated. He discovered a passion for environmental science, throwing himself into research projects with an enthusiasm that surprised even him. He made friends from diverse backgrounds, his worldview expanding with each new perspective he encountered. But perhaps the most significant growth happened during a long weekend in October, when Jake invited Zoe to visit the campus. As they walked hand in hand through the quad, crisp leaves crunching underfoot, Jake found himself opening up about his hopes and fears in a way he never had before. "Sometimes I wonder," he confessed, "if I'm doing the right thing, if I'm on the right path. There's so much pressure to have it all figured out, you know." Zoe squeezed his hand, her expression understanding. "I think that's normal, Jake. We're all just figuring it out as we go along. But from where I'm standing, you're doing pretty amazing." Jake smiled, grateful for her support. "Thanks. I want to make them proud, you know. My dad, Vanessa, my mom." Zoe stopped walking, turning to face Jake fully. "Jake," she said softly, "they're already proud of you. Not because of your grades or your major or any of that stuff. They're proud of you because of who you are, this incredibly resilient, kind, thoughtful person who's been through so much and come out stronger." As Jake looked into Zoe's eyes, he felt a sudden clarity. This was what his family had been trying to show him all along. That love wasn't about perfection or meeting some impossible standard. It was about acceptance, growth, and the courage to keep moving forward, even when the path was unclear. That night, as Zoe slept in the dorm's guest room, Jake sat at his desk, staring at the photo collage. On impulse, he pulled out his phone and opened the family group chat. "Hey," he typed. "I know it's late, but I just wanted to say, I love you guys. Thanks for everything." The responses came quickly, as if Robert and Vanessa had been waiting by their phones. "Robert, we love you too, son. So proud of you." "Vanessa, always, Jake, you're the best thing that's ever happened to us." As Jake crawled into bed that night, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The future was still uncertain, full of challenges and opportunities he couldn't yet imagine. But he knew with a bone-deep certainty that he had the strength to face whatever came his way, because he had a family, unconventional, imperfect, but fiercely loving, standing behind him. The next morning, as Jake and Zoe enjoyed breakfast in the bustling campus cafeteria, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Vanessa, and it contained a single photo, a snapshot of the garden she and Robert had been working on, now in full autumn bloom. The caption read, "New seasons bring new beauty, just like our family." Jake smiled, showing the photo to Zoe. As they bent their heads together, discussing plans for the day ahead, Jake felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. This was his life now, a blend of old and new, of family and independence, of past honor and future promise. As the semester continued, Jake found himself growing more confident in his ability to balance his new life with his family connections. He threw himself into his studies, discovering a particular interest in sustainable agriculture that he was excited to discuss with Vanessa during their calls. He joined the environmental club, eventually taking on a leadership role that both terrified and exhilarated him. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were still moments of doubt, times when the weight of his past threatened to overshadow his present. It was during one of these low points, after a particularly grueling week of midterms, that Jake received an unexpected visitor. He was slumped at his desk, staring blankly at his laptop screen, when a knock at the door jolted him out of his reverie. Opening it, he was stunned to find Robert standing there, a hesitant smile on his face. "Dad." Jake blinked in surprise. "What are you doing here?" Robert shrugged, looking a bit sheepish. I had a feeling you might need a little boost. Vanessa's idea, actually. She's got a bit of a sixth sense when it comes to you. As they settled into the small dorm room, Robert pulling out a thermos of Vanessa's homemade soup and a batch of Jake's favorite cookies, Jake felt a wave of emotion wash over him. This was what family meant, showing up, even when you hadn't asked, knowing exactly what you needed. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing. Jake opened up about his struggles and his triumphs, about the new friends he'd made and the old insecurities that still plagued him. Robert listened, offering advice when asked, but mostly just providing a comforting presence. As the evening wore on, Robert pulled out his phone, showing Jake pictures of the latest developments at home, the garden in full bloom, the restored Chevy gleaming in the driveway, Vanessa laughing as she tried to wrangle their newly adopted cat. We're thinking of fostering, you know, Robert said casually, watching Jake's reaction carefully. Kids, I mean. Vanessa's been talking about it for a while, and, well, we wanted to know how you'd feel about that. Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing the information. A year ago, the idea would have sent him spiraling, feeling replaced and forgotten. But now, looking at the hopeful expression on his father's face, Jake felt only a warm sense of pride and love. I think that's amazing, Dad, he said sincerely. You and Vanessa, you have so much love to give. Some kid out there is going to be really lucky to have you. Robert's eyes misted over, and he pulled Jake into a tight hug. Thank you, son, he murmured. Your blessing. It means everything. As Robert prepared to leave, promising to bring Vanessa for a visit soon, Jake felt a sense of completion he hadn't even realized he'd been missing. This was what they'd been working towards all along, not just healing the wounds of the past, but building a future where they could all grow and change together. The weeks that followed brought new challenges and new joys. Jake threw himself into his end-of-semester projects with renewed vigor, buoyed by the knowledge that he had a strong support system behind him. He started volunteering at a local community garden, finding joy in getting his hands dirty and watching things grow, a passion he knew he'd inherited from both his mothers in different ways. As the holidays approached, Jake found himself looking forward to going home with an excitement that surprised him. The dorm was abuzz with students making travel plans and saying goodbye, but Jake felt a sense of calm anticipation. The drive home was filled with a comfortable silence, broken only by the soft strains of Christmas carols on the radio. As they pulled into the driveway, Jake saw that the house was decked out in twinkling lights, a wreath adorning the front door. Inside, the scent of cinnamon and pine enveloped him, and Jake felt a lump form in his throat. It was more than just the holiday decorations or the familiar smells. It was the feeling of coming home to a place where he was truly, unconditionally loved. Vanessa emerged from the kitchen, flower on her cheek and a bright smile on her face. Jake, she exclaimed, pulling him into a warm hug. Oh, we've missed you so much. As they settled in for a cozy family dinner, Jake looked around the table, taking in the sight of his father and Vanessa, their faces alight with joy and love. The empty chair that had once been a painful reminder of his mother's absence now felt like a gentle acknowledgement, a space held in loving memory rather than grief. Later that evening, as they sat around the fireplace sharing stories and laughter, Jake realized something profound. The family he had now wasn't a replacement for what he'd lost, nor was it a poor substitute for some idealized version of what might have been. It was its own unique, beautiful creation, a tapestry woven from threads of loss and love, of past and present, of blood ties and chosen connections. As he drifted off to sleep that night, in his childhood bedroom that now bore touches of both his past and his evolving present, Jake felt a deep sense of peace. The journey hadn't been easy, and he knew there would be more challenges ahead. But he also knew, with unshakable certainty, that whatever life threw at them, they would face it together, as a family. The new chapter of their lives was unfolding, rich with possibility and hope. And Jake, surrounded by the love of his unconventional, imperfect, utterly perfect family, was ready to turn the page and see what adventures awaited them next.